I remember though when I was at school, my oldest friend perhaps was Daniel Hannan, who is now an MEP. And together we observed the progress of the Thatcher government, and in particular on the issue of Europe we took a greater and greater interest. And I recall at the time I was just really beginning to take an interest in economics and to seek to understand that interface of politics and economics. At the time that Margaret Thatcher and the noble Lord Lawson, as he now is, were involved in a disagreement about shadowing the Deutschmark. And I believe that on that issue, Margaret Thatcher was simply right. And it seemed to me even at the time that it was just too good. That we'd had this consumer-led recovery, but there seemed to be a boom, I thought, in my naive way as a teenager, that was getting out of control. And yet I heard that there couldn't be any problem because the pound was at the same level against the Deutschmark, and we cut interest rates to keep it below 3 Deutschmarks. And there was that disagreement between Chancellor and Prime Minister. And I think it was resolved terribly unfortunately for our country. But it was the Prime Minister who was right on that. And we saw towards the end of her time of office this issue of Europe become the central driving issue. And I think there is too much of a trend to see the last days of Margaret Thatcher's premiership as somehow that she had lost her touch or the man management was not there. And the issue of Europe wasn't just something that developed afterward for her. It was there, both at the central disagreement of economic policy in her government and the personal split that we saw with Geoffrey Howe. I don't believe it was about personality. On the 25th of June 1989, Geoffrey Howe with noble Lord Lawson said to Margaret Thatcher that unless she set a timetable to join the ERM, they would resign. She believed that Geoffrey Howe was behind that, and a month later she removed him from his post as Foreign Secretary. We then saw 18 months later in that statement when she came back from the Rome summit, which we all recall for no, no, no. And we know that led to Geoffrey Howe's resignation and then his later speech that set in train the events that led to her downfall. But what struck me much more about that debate, listening to it again this morning, was when she answered Tony Benn, who said to her, "You now say this, but how do we know this is any more than you seeking partisan short-term advantage by wrapping yourself in the flag? Since it was you who took us into the ERM without consulting the British people. It was you who signed the Single European Act. And it was you who sat in a cabinet that took us into the common market without a referendum." And Margaret Thatcher answered him. And she said she would have used different words. But in essence, she agreed with him. There was a mea culpa. That on those issues, he had been right. And she regretted the stance that she had taken. She said that while she was Prime Minister, and I believe it was her saying that that set in train the process that led to her fall. However, she also inspired, I think, a new generation of politicians. And that issue of whether ultimately we will be part of an ever closer union in Europe, or whether we will again be an independent country, is something which I believe Margaret Thatcher has allowed, at least kept open the possibility by restoring our national strength, that could once again be resolved in favour of independence. Yeah.